Hello there. I'm Delanghlin Williams from Seoul National University, where I work as an academic literacies instructor and an EMI consultant. My talk today conceptualizes the role of trust in South Korean English medium instruction translanguaging practices. Due to time restrictions, I will be focusing on these main areas. I'll begin by briefly explaining the background of translanguaging, and then after that I will explain the background of EMI in South Korean higher education. Then I'll provide an overview of my research, followed by a presentation of the results of my study, and finally I'll conclude with the implications of my study, which suggest a move towards a multilingual model and collaboration between EMI and EAP instructors. So, Traws-Ieithu, an original Welsh construct, or translanguaging as it's more globally known, was originally conceptualized as a bilingual system of learning, whereby one language, for example English, is being used to reinforce the other language, for example Welsh, in order to increase understanding. Since Williams's original conceptualization, translanguaging has been conceptualized more broadly as one integrated linguistic system using fluid linguistic repertoires within natural bilingual practices. So, in my research, I've been exploring how translanguaging is used in the South Korean EMI classroom. In the past decade, Ernesto Macaro and his colleagues at Oxford have used the following as a definition of EMI. So within EMI, there's a clear dichotomy between what EMI instructors do, in other words, they focus on teaching content, and what EAP instructors do, in other words, they focus on teaching academic language. On the next slide, I provide an overview of the current state of EMI in South Korea. On average, Korean universities offer 20% of EMI courses. The provision of support is mainly EGAP institutional support, which includes taught credit courses, online courses, one-to-one tutoring and workshops. The main motivation for EMI is the pursuit of internationalization, as it is worldwide. But in Korea, this is a more pressing pursuit because the birth rate is declining. It currently stands at 0.72, and by 2022 it's projected to fall even further as a result of the COVID pandemic. Since the turn of the millennium, various governmental policies have eased restriction on student mobility, and as we can see, this has had a significant increase on international numbers in less than 2 decades. I've seen it reported that the government have the goal of reaching 230,000 by 2023. So if pandemic restrictions end soon, based on current figures, this seems like a realistic target. So as an EMI researcher, a discovery I have made is that stakeholders find EMI challenging. On the next slide, I'll talk more about the causes for these challenges. The first is rapid top-down implementation. Studies have highlighted that the provision of support is inadequate to meet stakeholders' linguistic challenges. Secondly, to cope with linguistic challenges, stakeholders who share the same L1 use it during their EMI experiences. And thirdly, content instructors focusing on teaching content lack pedagogical training to cater to the challenges of EFL students in their class, and often reported is the fact that content instructors lack English proficiency. In my research, I explored students' perceptions of their EMI experiences. These were my 2 research questions. Firstly, how do students perceive the use of English or Korean affects access to subject content during their EMI experiences? And secondly, how do students perceive their academic linguistic challenges are being supported during their EMI experiences? The other bullets on this slide provide an overview of my research I'll just comment on one of them. I focused on recruiting engineering and business students because these majors offer the highest EMI amount of EMI courses compared to the other majors at the setting where I was conducting my research. As stated on the previous slide, I used the constructivist grounded theory. And from my constructivist view, early analysis indicated that student and instructors' uses of L1 and L2 linguistic codes are constructed by situations encountered during EMI, whereby the use of one code may facilitate content learning, while the other code could be constraining the situation. Early analysis indicated that one code was used over the other because of the presence of trust. For the purposes of my research, I viewed trust in line with the definition offered by Giddens as confidence in the reliability of a person or system regarding a given set of outcomes or events. And this definition helped me to view trust as an intuitive psychological construct within a social context that affects future action. A constructivist grounded theory is arrived at through a process of abductive reasoning, which involves two stages. Firstly, an inferential leap from potential theoretical explanations already identified, and secondly, a plausible interpretation through more data collection. The inferential leap from analysis, which was validated with further data collection, was understood as, in particular EMI situations, trust in an L1 or L2 linguistic code can shape and be shaped. In other words, trust is present in different degrees in different situated linguistic codes, ranging from the absence of trust to the presence of trust, as represented by Figure 1 on this slide. Two grounded theories emerged from analysis to respond to Research Question 1 and Research Question 2, namely trust affects access and support shapes trust. And there were 5 situated linguistic codes within each grounded theory, which emerged from analysis, which I'll talk more about now as I move on to present the results. So responding to Research Question 1, when translanguaging occurs in EMI classes, a degree of trust is present. On this slide, Sang-ho explains how translanguaging is practiced in the EMI class when discussing the subject content with his peers. And Jung-won describes how translanguaging is practiced by Korean first language content instructors to facilitate access to content in class. So in this situation, Korean linguistic codes reinforce English language content. Translanguaging does not only occur in EMI classes, but also, as we see here, in KMI classes, in other words, Korean medium instruction classes. Jung-won claims English is the language of engineering, and Ho-jin provides an understanding of how translanguaging plays a role in assessment. So in this situation, English linguistic codes reinforce Korean language content. When students access content from English textbooks, a degree of trust is present because of the provision of content depth, as Il-hyun and Jae-young explain on this slide. This was a consensus shared by the other participants because it increased their efficiency to access content depth. In contrast, a degree of trust is absent when students access content from Korean textbooks. As we can see, English language dominates the access of subject content on their majors. Students struggle with Korean not only because of insufficient depth coverage in translated textbooks, but also because the specialist vocabulary often has awkward Hanja translations. So, in this situation, a degree of trust is absent as the student's first language, in other words Korean, constrains students' access to the English subject content. So when accessing content through the delivery in L2, students' degree of trust is absent. As Sangun and Hojin explain on this slide, a reason for this is because of instructors' lack of English proficiency and appropriate methodology to cater to the EFL students taking their classes. For this matter, student access to the subject content is constrained in this situation. Moving on now to respond to research question 2, the provision of support shapes student trust. For instance, the use of L1 helps students with their linguistic challenges, and as a result, a degree of trust is present in this situation. As seen on this slide, it helps students to articulate themselves to ask questions in class or during exams. Ultimately, trust is present as it helps students and content instructors to reduce any ambiguity through their shared L1. In EMI courses, the grading system is not based on a bell curve. In other words, it's absolute instead of relative. Students perceived a reason for this was to encourage the less proficient students. So for this reason, the participants shared a degree of trust in EMI courses as they believed these courses were presenting less of a challenge for them to obtain a better grade than the KMI courses that they were taking. On this slide, Sangun describes how he and his friends, who are considered to be students struggling with L2, they gravitate towards really fluent classmates to try to be with them in groups for project work. But in actuality, they really want to avoid classes in English. When selecting courses, they scrutinize the syllabi to see which course presents the fewest linguistic challenges, and then they choose the easiest one. It appears that a lack of L2 proficiency is preventing the students who struggle from taking some EMI courses. So a degree of trust is absent in situation 8 for students of low L2 proficiency, as they perceive a lack of support for the challenges they face to comprehend the subject content. In situation 9, students feel they themselves are responsible for supporting their EAP needs. Perceptions ranged from there being no specific support, no external support, and the need for students to find their own way to survive. They perceive content instructors are responsible for teaching content, and a degree of trust is absent in the ability of content instructors to support students' EAP needs in class. Students perceive some instructors as setting less of a challenge in EMI classes to make access of subject content in L2 less pressured for students. However, a low challenge has an adverse effect on the students' motivations. In situation 10, a degree of trust is absent, as oversimplifying the challenge of the subject content compromises its quality. On this slide, I present the outcome of my research, which is that translanguaging is situated by degrees of trust present in situated linguistic codes, which form students' linguistic repertoire to help them shape their EMI experiences and develop knowledge. The relationship between support and access to subject content within this conceptualization is illustrated by figure 2 on this slide, in that support shapes a degree of trust in a linguistic code, and a degree of trust within a linguistic code affects access. I'll move on now to talk about the implications from my research. The first implication is that EMI policymakers need to move towards multilingual models. The outcomes of my research support earlier research in that translanguaging in South Korean multilingual EMI classrooms facilitates a deeper understanding of the subject content. However, if translanguaging will become a more overt part of future policies, different contexts need to critically examine their monolingual EMI policies and plan for translanguaging as a pedagogy in context-sensitive ways by taking both the needs of national and international students into account. For instance, the results of this study have shown that in the South Korean EFL context, L1 and L2 serve different purposes in different situations in EMI classes. The use of both linguistic codes may have slight variations in EMI settings of other contexts. As things currently stand in the South Korean context, translanguaging seems to be a latent policy and therefore seems to be used on an ad hoc basis, which implies that more strategic planning is called for. Lu and Fang provide a suggestion as to how content instructors could gauge the percentage of L1 to use at the beginning of courses by simply asking students to self-evaluate their language problems. This would enable instructors to respond to the students' specific needs through translanguaging, but for translanguaging to overtly be a part of future policies suggests an extensive needs analysis is required of individual contexts. The final implication of my study is that collaboration between EMI and EAP instructors is needed. Irrespective of whether students enroll in an EMI or a KMI course, the quality of the content should not be compromised. Linguistic challenges should not obstruct students from enrolling in EMI courses either. Collaboration between EMI and EAP practitioners could address these issues. EAP instructors have the tools to support the linguistic challenges of both student and instructors. Students need continued EAP support throughout their discipline's EMI courses. Collaboration between language and content instructors could support the EAP needs of students. The language instructors could also work with content instructors to ensure that the quality of the content is not compromised. It's clear from this study that translanguaging strengthens access to the subject content in EMI courses, and this implies that the provision of EAP support may best be provided by multilingual language teachers. In other words, translanguaging can be used as a pedagogy to provide the requisite EAP support, and in this way students may feel less burdened in that they can use their L1 to seek support, and the same may be said of content instructors. I'd like to finish my talk today with a quote I heard from Julie Dearden in a conference in 2017, where she stated as follows: "If our aim is to create international universities with intercultural communication, EMI should be a multilingual, multicultural tool, and a monolingual, monologic teaching approach will not deliver." This helps me to reiterate the point I'm making in this talk, which is that policymakers need to realise that a move towards internationalisation is also a move towards a multilingual future. With that in mind, I hope that for scholarship, the outcomes of my research proposes a conceptualisation of trust in relation to delivering and researching future translanguaging pedagogies. These are my references. And I'd like to thank you for watching my presentation. And if you'd like to contact me, here is my email address. So thanks again, and I wish you well for the rest of the conference.